Hey everybody, this is Pastor Megan and I am here in my house and recording a little bit of Bible study for everybody today. Because it's Friday, I thought I would pick a book that you might not have heard of before. It's called The Acts of Thecla, and if you're watching this live, you can find the link to that either on my Facebook links below, or you can just type in on Google PBS Acts of Thecla and it'll give you the original text if you want to follow along. Otherwise, when we get the full video up, I'll put the comments below with any additional resource links where you can learn more about today's Bible study. The Acts of Thecla, and well, the Acts of Paul and Thecla is the full name of the book, even though Paul is not really the most important character that is a part of this story. This is a text that was really widely read and is interesting to me because it's a text of someone who was born female and dresses as a male for a little while. And so anything with some kind of transgender theme to it is interesting for times like these when we might think that there are people and ways of being that are brand new, but in fact have been a part of our biblical readings for a very long time. Thecla, her shrine where she was thought to live was in Syria, and the place that commemorates the cave where she was thought to have spent, well, let's stop using she. Let's use they, because we don't know what Thecla's gender was or what Thecla was into. The cave that Thecla lived in for about 72 years was in Syria. Unfortunately, part of the monastery that was honoring Thecla was destroyed by Al-Qaeda, but it was since fixed up again and is a place that you could visit if one could go outside, if one could go to Syria, and it wasn't quite as war-torn as it seems to be right now. So that's kind of the context of Thecla. Thecla was one of the books that was really widely read, particularly among women, and gets moved to Apocrypha by St. Jerome. Apocrypha is like a word that's like, well, it's really popular, but we're not sure if it's true. And you'll see why when we're talking about the Acts of Thecla, why parts of it might have been mythologized, or maybe that's what happened. We don't particularly know. It seems pretty biblical and in line with a lot of sacred stories that we have. But just know that it was something that was really popularly read, and then was something that became less popular as people started to wonder if this was kind of the way that people should live and behave. So chapter 1, let's start with chapter 1 of the Acts of Thecla. Chapter 1 is a description about Paul, which I think is kind of funny because Paul's description is kind of similar to the way that I've been described before, aside from the bald part. I have a lot of hair under here, but I like that the very first descriptor of Paul is eyebrows. Makes me think that he was an interesting guy. I'm going to avoid descriptions of his nose because we know that Paul was Jewish, and that would not be something that we should dwell in. Bow-legged, strongly built, but then the final descriptor for Paul is full of grace, which is way nicer than the way he's kind of stockily described, like short and stocky. Strongly built says it nicer. Then in this section, Paul has his own version of the Beatitudes. Beatitude is a way of like just saying a long poetic way of naming that people are blessed, like saying that blessed are the, right? So Jesus's Beatitudes are like, blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are the poor, for they shall, right? It's blessed, blessed, blessed. Paul's blesseds in this Acts of Paul and Thecla are, blessed are those who deny their body everything. Blessed are those who are sober. Blessed are those who are celibate and chaste. Yikes. This is a part of an early Christian tradition that believes that denying yourself any sort of pleasure or satisfaction, glories of the world, as it's called, was the way to live, because again, Paul thought Jesus was going to come and as soon as possible in like a few minutes. So you might as well not do any of the things that make life complicated, right? So don't get married, don't have sexual intercourse, because if you do some of the complicated things, maybe you won't see the kingdom of heaven. However, the Acts of Paul and Thecla go so far as to say that Paul believed unless you were a virgin, you would never enter the kingdom of heaven. You'll, if you've ever read Corinthians, Corinthians is long letters to people who were having arguments with Paul about whether or not they needed to stay celibate in order to be a part of God's beloved community. Just so you know, I'm a part of the Lutheran tradition. We do not believe that celibacy is a requirement that God gives most people. It's a requirement God gives a few people, and for those people it is a blessing, and for everyone else it is a burden that kind of leads to sexual misconduct and bad things happening in the world. So Paul, throughout this entire text, this whole text is going to be about arguing that people should remain celibate, and this is one of the consequences that happens as a result of Paul very strongly believing people are blessed because they are asexual. So if you are an asexual person, awesome, this is a text for you, right? Chapter 2 of the Acts of Paul and Thecla is where Thecla, it says Thecla's been engaged to this man who like loves her and is kind to her, and hears Paul through the window and listens to Paul's preaching, enjoys Paul's preaching so much that she stops like eating or drinking and is just like always listening to Paul's debates with this person that he is staying with. And it makes her mom mad. Let's call her birth mother, because that's this kind of story. So the birth mother is upset, contacts the betrothed. I'm not even going to give him a name because he's not the center of the story, right? Contracts the betrothed. The family has full-on mourning, like that their child is dead just because she's like sitting in the window and listening to someone smart, right? So it's that kind of story where it's like, oh no, our kid wants to be smart. I guess they're dead, right? So yay, that women get to learn and have education now. So she contacts the person that Thecla is engaged to. He gets so upset that Thecla is like hearing this message of celibacy out the window and offers Paul money to like leave the town so that he can still get married to Thecla. Apparently she was pretty hotsy-totsy, even into her 70s is kind of what this, into her 90s is what this story kind of implies. But Paul says resurrection, being a part of God's Easter blessing promises, requires that we do not defile our flesh, right? So that's what Thecla continues to hear out the window. Chapter 3, the person that Thecla is engaged to decides to have like a drunken party, like do the opposite of Paul's sobriety, and then decides after this that he wants to learn about what Paul's all about. Like he loves Thecla so much that he wants to learn about what she loves and like learn about it too. But then he like gets sick of it. He's like, no, he gets really mad and he tries to make it so that Paul has to go to jail. In a jealousy way. In other versions of this text, I've given you kind of a benign version of it, the PBS version, right? There are other versions of this text that make it sound like it's really Thecla's mother who's doing all of the instigating for Thecla to be killed. Sorry, spoiler alert, they're going to try to burn Thecla at the stake. In other texts, it's Thecla's mother. You'll see why later in this story. Having it be women who are really mad at Thecla and not the men who are wanting women not to be celibate is a part of this story. So in chapter 4, Paul, they go and talk to Paul. He's not very pastoral. He's not like, oh, your problems sound terrible. Instead, hold on one second. So instead, Paul decides that he's going to get really angry with everyone and wants God to bring vengeance on the people who are mad that he is preaching. Then the governor orders Paul to be put in prison. And Thecla, in her first act of like gender defiance, she takes out her earrings. And this might not seem like a very important turn in the story, but there is about 12 different saints who become saints because they believe that they should live as men or decide that they want to live as men in monasteries. And one of the big symbolic acts about how they do this is they take their earrings out. So she takes her earrings out and she gives them to the person who is jailing Paul so that she can not get Paul out of the jail. This is like backwards of what most people do. She bribes her way into the jail. So she wants to go be locked up in jail with Paul and listen to his teachings. She also gives away like a really fancy mirror. So she's giving up these signs of vanity and things that would make her be able to court men, essentially. So she sees that Paul is brave, that Paul does not mind suffering, and she like kisses his chains to be like embracing the suffering that Paul is having. In chapter 5, Thecla's family is like, where's our daughter? She was like at that window for a really long time, wouldn't even leave to eat. Now she's just gone. They figure out that she's in the jail, and they decide that both she and Paul should be brought before the governor to be tried and put to death is what they're urging for. And it's in other texts, the mom who's really, really pushing for that to happen. In many stories, what ends up happening when people want others to be persecuted for their faith is that they, the person who's in charge, the ruler, decides that it's really like these people are really smart and they enjoy their conversations, right? So there's this conversation that's going to happen as we get closer to Good Friday where the rulers are going to be like, oh, I like the way you talk. I don't really want to put you to death. These other people want you to be put to death. So the governor decides Paul should not be put to death. But because so many people are upset by Thecla, Thecla should be put to death, right? Paul is the one who did the preaching. Thecla just heard it passively through a window, but Thecla is the one who's going to be put to death because she doesn't want to marry engagement dude anymore. So they take her to this place where they're going to burn her at the stake. She has a vision that she sees that Paul has come to like look at her, and she sees Jesus inside Paul, and then Jesus like ascends. And so she like sees this whole resurrection process happening. They light the wood around Thecla on fire, but there's an earthquake and it rains and puts out the fire. So this is going to be a part of the theme of how Thecla is preserved and how her life is saved. It's going to come out of the Old Testament readings, and particularly in the Exodus story. In the Exodus story, they had the fire that was in front of them, and a light that was behind them that's kind of like protecting them from the military. Whichever side the military was coming from, there's this big fire that's keeping them back, and there's this light that's showing them that God is with them. And so Thecla is going to have these elements with her when she's surviving all the ways that people want to kill her. That's essentially what's happening. And so there's this earthquake, and the fire is put out by rain, and yay, she doesn't die. And this is also kind of an allusion to that story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who are put in this fiery furnace and they're set on fire, but they don't die, right? So there's all these different ancient traditions that are the same way that Thecla's kind of taking on this idea of being a martyr and being saved by God in super like great ways that like other biblical characters also have been saved. But I think maybe she gets saved like too many times in a row, and that's why St. Jerome's like, this story is too much for me. Chapter 6, Paul hides in a cave. once he hears what's happening to Thecla, he takes his robe off to have it sold to go buy some bread because they're super hungry because they're hiding in a cave. And Paul starts praying for God to save Thecla. And at that time, then Thecla walks in and is like, yay, I am saved, right? Then they eat the bread when it comes back, and lo and behold, it's the same miracle amount of bread that Jesus makes at one of the miracles of loaves and fishes, where 5 loaves of bread come, and that being symbolic of enough food to feed all of the nations, right? So this idea of being connected to the Jesus story and Jesus's miracles. So Thecla is tied to those Old Testament stories of people saving God through fire and rain. And Thecla is tied to these miracle stories of Jesus in providing bread for the poor. And feeding the poor is kind of a theme through this story, which is kind of cool. Like, save all that time you save by being celibate and not drinking, and take care of your neighbor, which is what celibacy in monastic life is supposed to be at its best, when those people are called to do it. In chapter 7, Thecla goes to Antioch. Well, before this, so Paul is delighted that Thecla has been converted. He hears the whole story about what happens, but he still doesn't want Thecla to like be with him when he's off evangelizing, because he thinks that Thecla's too pretty and no one can learn if Thecla's in the room, because they won't hear a message about celibacy if they just keep falling in love with Thecla. And so she's like, okay, cool. And right, because this is the nice version, the PBS version of the story that I gave you. In other stories, Thecla immediately starts wearing men's clothes, and Paul keeps saying, go away, don't follow me, don't teach with me. And Thecla just does anyway. Like, she just doesn't listen to him because she acts like she's Paul's equal. But in this text, they have a very loving like parting. Paul's like blessing her to go out and do her mission. And so Thecla goes to Antioch, which is where Paul just was thrown out of. So we can imagine how it's going to go. But Thecla goes there, and immediately a man falls in love with her. Wah, wah. And this is what Paul kisses Thecla. And she cries out, don't force things upon me. So there's, you know, I forgot to do a trigger warning at the beginning, but there's several points in Thecla's story where people try to rape her. Also, spoiler alert, they don't. So part of Thecla's story is that she remains a virgin all the way into her 90s when she dies. So Thecla cries out not to be forced into rape, but she is able to like rip the coat of this like royal dude who's trying to like take advantage of her and throw his crown off on the ground so that people know that she has made a fool of him. But this gets her condemned to death again, but this time by wild beasts. So this makes her a part of the Daniel story as well, right? Daniel in the lion's den. In chapter 8, people knew that when she was being punished, it was unjust. But as she's being brought out into this amphitheater, most of the women, right? This is a story where it's like the women have to be mad at her, not the men, because it looks like they just are thinking about their own sexual gratification. Most of the women are like, boo, die, you're terrible. Except for one woman whose name is Tryphena. And she shouts out, you're going to be my daughter now. And she like adopts her, and she's like a wealthy royal lady. So that's good, I guess. So she's brought into the amphitheater, and Tryphena not only is like, I want to adopt you, you're my daughter now, but like, kill me instead of you, which martyrdom, don't choose it right now. But hooray for the story that someone loves her enough to like not send her off to be killed by bears and lions. Chapter 9, they strip her naked except for one cloth, which reminds me of the Gospel of Mark, when there is the faithful person who's there at the time of Jesus and they just have the one cloth, or the person in the Gospel of Mark who is the person who witnesses the resurrection. So there's this very long, like, I only have one cloth I don't own things, I've rejected wealth kind of symbology going on. She's stripped naked, but they can't see her nakedness because, right, her virginity is very important to the story. And they send in lions and bears. Oh my. The female lion comes to protect her, right? And the female bear comes to eat her face off. But the female lion kills the female bear. Then a male lion comes to eat Thecla, and the female lion kills the male lion, but ends up dying in the process. And the story talks about how the women who were against Thecla were more upset that the female lion died than that Thecla would die, which is bad news. Then this is the like women, sister women, superwoman part of the story. Thecla baptizes herself. So the Ethiopian eunuch in the Acts of the Apostles is this like cool trans person who's like smart and the head of the economy, and is like has to trick an apostle kind of by being like, what is to prevent me from being baptized? And this is a really cool empowerment story because it then says trans people can no longer be separated from the holiest places in the temple. This text takes it a step farther, and that's why we're reading it today. Is it's like, woo! You can read this as like feminism or like trans power, whatever lens you want to use, that's fine. Thecla baptizes herself. Even Jesus doesn't baptize Jesus' self, right? Sorry, I called Thecla her again. Apologies. But how cool is that? Thecla baptizes themselves. It's awesome. And she does it by like jumping into this moat of sea calves, which I'm imagining are like orcas, right? Who could like eat you. And the governor's like, no, don't die from the sea calves. But she's like, I'm baptizing myself. And then the fire comes again, and some lightning comes, and it like kills all the sea calves. So sorry, dead orcas, but she baptized herself. And the lightning and the fire like makes people's vision blurred, so they don't even see Thecla in like a white sheet in the water moment. So they don't see her naked. They don't see Thecla's nakedness, right? And then all the beasts that are left in this amphitheater to like eat Thecla take a nap. They're like, lightning, fire, I'm sleepy, right? So Thecla doesn't get eaten, and I think that's awesome. But they were like, no, we still want to kill her. The guys, the men this time, convinced the governor, like, we should still kill Thecla. So they tie her to bulls. They tie her to bulls, people. They tie her to bulls. And the idea is that the bulls will run and drag Thecla to death. But, right, fire. There's fire and thunderstorms, and it blinds the bulls, and it sets the rope on fire, and she's able to separate, and she doesn't die. Hooray, Thecla baptized herself, right? So the governor now is afraid that Thecla is going to like destroy the whole city, right? The whole fire, thunder thing. Thecla has now killed a whole bunch of the beasts. So the governor wants to keep her safe. And that's what happens. So the governor gives Thecla their clothes back. But the women now, instead of wanting Thecla dead, are like, we believe in the God of Thecla. Like, the women are on board now. And Tryphena, the person who has decided to be Thecla's mom, brings Thecla back to their house and takes care of them. So really does like live up to this idea of like, I'm your parent now, which is good because Thecla's birth mom still is kind of grumpy. Then Thecla starts dressing as a man. So we don't know if Thecla's dressing like a man because she's like sick and tired of the people trying to rape Thecla. or if it's out of kind of a gender awareness. Either way, name it or claim it, whatever way it empowers you in present day, like name it and claim it. It's awesome, right? Chapter 10, Thecla now tells Paul what happens. It goes back. Oh, so her new mother, Tryphena, sent like just a ton of money to Paul to like fund everything that he's up to. So that helps, right? And sends a bunch of clothing that are going to be given to the poor. Some of the versions, again, say that Paul's not happy, but I gave you the PBS version to read. So it's a little bit happier of a story. So Thecla then goes to their birth mother's house and tries to persuade their birth mother that loving Jesus is awesome and that they should consider it. But to no avail. And then Thecla like goes to a cave in Syria at some point and lives there for 72 years. Caves are very symbolic. You'll see a lot of caves in paintings about Jesus, and particularly in paintings about Mary, the mother of Jesus, because caves are like the womb. So it's like having a sacred womb. So it's another like virginity reference. Chapter 11 of this story says that people try to come and worship Thecla, that there's all these miracles or worship with her or to be blessed by Thecla. And they like put out this rumor that she actually is following the goddess Diana instead of Jesus, and that causes all kinds of trouble. But then at the ripe old age of 90, some men come along convinced that they're going to be the people to deflower Thecla, which is pretty crappy, right? Think of all the things she just survived. So the final miracle of Thecla is that Thecla prays and the rocks open up in the cave and like swallow her to her death instead of her getting raped. Yay, she died. But she died flowered with her flower intact. So that is the 11 chapters that I have given you all. It's a strange story if you're not familiar with other apocrypha writings or some of the Nag Hammadi texts. They were the texts that were found with the Dead Sea Scrolls. There's about 280 different kind of Greek gospels that go in addition to some of the writings of Jesus. And so if you're not familiar with how these texts have worked, the Acts of Thecla can seem like a really strange text because of the parts of it that seem fanciful, like all of the beasts being survived and surviving being set on fire. And so the purpose again of us looking at it is if you are in a space where you are hoping for some empowerment, you might be trapped in your house, you might be wondering how you can still be an advocate for a better world. Like what happens to the Me Too movement if we're all stuck in our houses, right? Like that there are texts that can feed you and can help you along the way and help you in this journey of your faith and enriching you of being a better person. And perhaps the gift of a lot of churches being closed right now, or a lot of places being on hold. Hold on one sec. There you go. Kids, there's kids in my house. The part of the difficulty, here's what I'm saying, is the gift of this time is that you might have the opportunity to read some text that you normally wouldn't have read, that you can embrace, and you can look beyond what the typical lectionary would have been in times like these. Do some reading on your own or encourage your pastor to go outside of the box, because times like these are scary and tough and difficult. And if we can find awesome stories from the past, from our sacred journey, that remind us that the full ways of our embodiment, everything from sexual orientations that are beyond the limits of things that probably a pastor would be doing, or things that are on the full other end of the spectrum of being asexual or not engaging with sexuality. All of those things in that spectrum can be found in faithful texts, and all of those ways of embodying and dressing and expressing your gender can be found in faithful texts. And times like these, when things are maybe on hold, they're getting a little topsy-turvy, it's a beautiful time to explore some of the more creative texts that are out there, and to think about some of the things that don't fit into our typical cycle of church readings. So I hope that today's Bible study inspired you to check out the Acts of Thecla if you haven't seen them before, or just inspires you to look at the possibility that your life and your living it is a part of the continued creation story and the love of God, because you, dear heart, are beloved. And if anyone has ever told you otherwise, if anyone has ever told you that it's not possible for God to love you, or that the way your family is or your life is outside of the realms of what God thinks of as sacred, I'm terribly, terribly sorry. You are beloved, named, claimed, and I hope that when you need it in your deepest struggles, lightning and thunder and all of the miracles of Thecla will be there for you, keeping you safe in all you are and all that you do. Thank you, everyone, for watching our video.